And my guest today on the Love, Happiness, and Success podcast is author, journalist, and speaker Lydia Denworth. Lydia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, I'm so excited to speak with you about your work, particularly around the importance of relationships and the
Hmm.
impact of loneliness, because it's just such a timely topic. Um, but before we jump in, maybe
Hmm.
you could tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your background and how you came to be such an authority on this particular topic.
Sure, happy to. So, I am a science journalist and I am a contributing editor at Scientific American, and my work has appeared in lots of publications like The Atlantic, The New York Times, Newsweek, Time, many other places. I've written three books and on a variety of topics, but the most recent one is Friendship, the Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond, which
Mm.
we're going to talk about. And I got interested in this. So, primarily as a science journalist, I cover the brain and neuroscience and psychology, although, in fact, I've branched out. I do a lot of different things, and my first book was about environmental science, but it's all interesting, it's all important. But I came to the topic of friendship through my interest in the brain, actually,
Mm.
originally. And I got curious about a field called social neuroscience, which was all about looking at the ways that the connections that we have with other people kind of reverberate down those invisible webs that connect us to other people,
Mm.
right? And how
Mhm.
they have a physiological effect on us. And the
Mhm.
fact that scientists were taking that so seriously now,
Mhm.
when before they didn't as much, was really interesting to me. And so I've spent most of the last 5 years thinking about the science of social behavior and friendship in particular. And now I have this book out, and it came out at this moment that we are all in social isolation. So it turns out to meet the moment in an interesting and unforeseen way.
It really does. It really does. And I'm so excited to talk more about how to create and sustain and fully
Hmm.
embrace our friends and relationships during a time of distancing.
Hmm.
Before we go there, though,
Hmm.
I'm wondering if we can go back and talk a little bit more about, 5 years of research around the impact of relationships. And you mentioned something so fascinating to me, which is the emerging science around the way our relationships actually change our brains.
They
Can you
do.
talk a little bit more about what you've learned through your research with that regard?
Sure. I mean, on some level, everything that we do
Hmm.
changes our brains. Our day-to-day experience changes our brains. But what is really interesting about this new sort of line of research is that, first of all, well, two things. One is that they're understanding how much of the brain is designed to be social, how much of the brain is engaged in our social lives day to day, our interactions, our everything from the way your vision and hearing work, take in information about the people around you, language, obviously, listening to that and processing it, but also then things like your ability to uh, understand the complexity of relationships in a group of people around you, to take someone else's perspective, to have a sense of your own self and identity, and all of these things are complicated skills that the brain has to master. And as we, when we're young and as we're going through life, and it's only really relatively recently. I mean, the 1990s were the decade of the brain in which the technology made it possible suddenly to look inside the brain and understand a lot more about what was going on. And then that began, a lot of that began with other things like cognition and memory and learning. And it's only now that there's this much more extended focus on the social aspects of the brain and the recognition of how much of what we were already looking at has these social components. And just as a small example, like the fact that a baby looking at motion like a hand waving recognizes that as social in a way that motion like a truck moving, the baby processes it slightly differently, even a young baby, right? So it's not just motion. There are parts of the brain that are designed to recognize that something is social, meaning that it has to do with interaction between two individuals, right? And that what one does is has some effect or signal to the other. And so that part is fascinating, but also what's really fascinating is that it doesn't just affect our brain. Our social relationships get under our skin, is how biologists talk about it, and they affect our health, right? They affect our cardiovascular system, our immune system, cognitive health, your risk of dementia, your risk of your immune system. I mentioned, but I wanted to specify that it has to do with your susceptibility and resilience to viruses, relevant in the moment, and inflammation, things like that. So part of what was so fascinating to me is how much goes on in the brain and how much is going on in the body, and that these social relationships, these friendships that exist entirely outside of the body could do that and have that power is really intriguing.
That is so intriguing.
Mhm.
And, so this goes so much deeper and further than our tendency to see faces on the surface of Mars that, prime
Yes.
that there's so much recruited in terms of not just our brains, but our physiologically um, designed systems that are highly attuned to other people.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And fascinating relationships between health and and the presence or absence of relationships. And actually, um, I have seen research looking at how the types of relationships that you have and the psychological mood state of your friends can
Mm.
impact your own in terms of, the presence of a highly depressed person in a social group can impact the subjective wellness psychologically of a.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
Uh, yes, that work, a lot of that work, I think what you're probably referring to is the work on social
Mhm.
networks,
Yeah.
showing that it's actually not just your immediate friends, but their friends. There's
Mm.
an effect that goes out to 3 degrees of separation. And that, being around depressed people can make you more depressed, and vice versa. People who are
Mhm.
happier can make you happier.
Yeah.
And it's just really striking how much
Mhm.
the other people that we come across or that are part of our lives day to day have this visceral effect on our well-being and our
Yeah.
happiness.
Mhm. So, and you've been exploring this topic so deeply, and I'm wondering what you have made of that. I mean, not just in terms of the mechanism, but really the impact on people and relatedly, I mean, what we all need to be thinking about in terms of those relationships in order not to just foster our own health and
Right.
wellness, but
Right.
those of others in our lives.
Right. You know, it's why well, let me put it this way, I guess. When I started, I thought, well, friendship, I don't know. People think they know all about friendship. It feels so familiar. It feels like this thing that we all do and we kind of take it for granted, and maybe there's not a lot to say. But then I felt like it's a little bit like peeling an onion and digging deeper. That's what I was really trying to do, is to deliver the evidence for why friendship is as important as diet and exercise, essentially, and just kind of give it its fair standing, and not to write about it in quite the same way that I feel most people do. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the other things, it's just that nobody had really focused on the biology and evolution of it before. And so I thought I could do it a little bit differently, and kind of just really make people take it more seriously. I mean, that's what it's done for me. But the other piece of this that I kind of love is that the this understanding that there's this powerful biology to friendship it doesn't just make it something that you ought to be paying attention to and prioritizing. I think it gives you permission to hang out with your friends and recognize that you're doing something good for yourself and good for them. And that to give that social interaction the sort of respect that it deserves. But what's lovely is that most of us love that kind of social interaction. I mean, not everybody, but most people do. We have a really good time with our friends, but we often feel like it has to come after work and family obligations and all these other things, and those things matter. But I thought that, or to me, that's the fundamental power of this message, is to understand that there's a reason you really enjoy being with your friends and it's good for you, and so go for it.
As you were talking, I was actually thinking about a personal experience. So this probably happened maybe 6 weeks ago, but it was when we were in the midst of like lockdown here
Yes,
in
right.
Colorado, and I had not seen any of my friends or family, for that matter, in person
Hmm.
in many weeks. And I had two friends of mine come over. They did not come in the house. We sat probably 15 feet apart in my backyard.
Hmm.
Everybody went. We were only there for probably 45 minutes or an hour, just sort of sitting in the
Right.
grass and catching up. And I felt probably 30 pounds lighter after that experience. And it was interesting, Lydia, because I think
Yeah.
I hadn't fully realized the impact on me of that lack until
Hmm.
spending just a little bit of time with friends talking about our recent experiences, and
Hmm.
nothing really of consequence
Hmm.
until after they left. I was like, don't go. Just like the visceral
Yeah.
experience you're describing. And so, and I'm wondering, what in your research have you discovered? I mean, you're talking about evolution and biology and just this depth of understanding of how vitally important and impactful these kinds of interactions are.
Hmm.
What do you make of why?
Why is it
Yeah,
that way? Well, first of all, I just want to say that that's been to me
yeah.
so interesting in this moment, this pandemic, is
Mm-hmm.
that I feel like on some levels, my job of preaching, the importance of friendship has been done for me, because we've been thrown into this crisis. And whenever you're thrown into a crisis, normally what we do and what we reach for is social support. We reach, to we want to come together with our friends and family, and that, of course, was the very thing we could not do this time, at least not in person. And and but there's a reason we're driven to do that, and I'll come to that in a second. But what I wanted to say is that I really do feel that this pandemic had the effect of helping people to appreciate more what was kind of right in front of them all the time, right? Because you don't know what you have till it's gone. And it would have been very hard for me to take away friendship from everybody in the world, but the pandemic did that for me. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but it did have a little silver lining, which is that it helped us to see this thing, and what I hope is that when we're done, we don't go back to our old ways, that we keep that appreciation and respect for the importance of these kinds of relationships. And to answer your question, really, this a strong positive social bond, it does go back. It's an evolutionary drive, and there are real evolutionary advantages, it turns out, to being someone who is good at making and maintaining relationships, and not just in people but in other species. In fact, that's how you can tell that there's a universal story. There's a bigger something bigger going on here, that this drive to connect, is so fundamental. And so it leads to longevity, living longer, and in other species it leads to reproductive success, meaning more and healthier babies. And those, in evolutionary terms, you really can't do better than longevity and reproductive success. It's what it's all about. And so the fact that animals who had these strong positive bonds, got these benefits from it, sort of made all the scientists who were watching them say, wait a minute, what's this about? And at the same time, in humans, we were beginning to see that there were these links between social relationships and health. And initially in the 1980s, say, when those first links were beginning to be found, people thought, well, it must have to do with what they call social support, which is the very important concept of, people being there for each other, right down to the level of everything from, bringing lasagna should you have a death in the family, to driving you to the hospital if you need to go. And that is all important and true. But the fact that in baboons in Africa, you see the same effects, and baboons cannot drive each other to the hospital
Or make a
is,
lasagna.
or
Yeah.
make a lasagna, is really interesting and important. And it's showing us that there is something else going on that's more fundamental. And so really what friendship is all about is creating relationships that are there for when the hard times come, to help protect you from the lions or to help you find food. And I think that the rewards, the benefits we get, so we feel good. Literally, the reward centers in our brains are primed, as yours were when your friends came over, to enjoy this and to find it satisfying and fulfilling. And that keeps you coming back for more. And then that means that over time, you've built that relationship. It's A relationship is essentially a series of repeated interactions, right? Every time you see your friend, you have another conversation or more things happen. And then the next time you build on what happened before, right? It's always related. And you do all of that so that in a time of crisis, that friend is there for you. And of course, that's not everybody in your social circle doesn't fit into that's why we have usually a smaller group that we really count on. But that is fundamentally, from an evolutionary point of view, that's what it's for. And that is why I think you and your friends so felt that relief in being together, and that sort of outlet you feel. I mean, in human terms, not in baboon terms, but I think too, you get to talk about how you're feeling. You get right, you get an outlet. You feel seen and understood and loved and cared for. And that's what we need, that sense of belonging and care.
That is just so profoundly important. And going back to something you said earlier, like it's so easy to dismiss those
Mm-hmm.
interactions as
Mm-hmm.
being less important, as
Right.
oh my God, I'm thinking about my own, I mean, not even work, but like laundry and stuff, all the stuff that we have to do that feels
Yeah.
like the checklists and the priorities, and really refocusing back on how fundamentally important it is to be investing in those relationships. And what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying too, I think is so appropriate for so many people, including myself, is that when the chips are down, that
Mm-hmm.
is really all we have in some ways, when it feels like life is falling apart, or when you're going through a
Yeah.
loss. And I know in my own life, having recently lost my mother, um,
Mm-hmm.
I can't even tell you how meaningful and moving it was to get a card or a text, or phone calls, or people sending things. And it's, even friendships that um, were light and just fun and enjoyable previously, but feeling that care
Mm-hmm.
in exactly those moments of loss and pain was so important. And I think tying back into what you were saying is to not minimize the enormous impact and need that we all have sooner or later.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, and I think when we're in good times, it can be easy to prioritize other things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only in those moments of loss or hardship that we really need each other in the way that you're saying. Hmm.
And we should be really aware
Yeah.
of showing up for
Yeah.
each other. I
Yes.
think it's such a critical, it's actually a fundamental piece of the definition of friendship
Mm,
in science, is that friendship is cooperative, reciprocal, there's this
yeah.
give and take. And that, as you said, it doesn't mean that it's this tit for tat accounting.
Hmm.
I had you for dinner on Saturday, so you have me in the
Yeah.
land when we can have dinner together again, which
I'm
will
thinking like,
happen.
what? I want
Right.
to go to dinner.
Someday, live with me metaphorically here, work with me metaphorically. Imagine you could have dinner at your friend's house, and then your friend could come to dinner at your house. but it's not just an immediate back and forth, right? But it is about, in the grand scheme of things, there needs to be this reciprocity, this back and forth. And when you lose someone close to you, I mean, I felt this when I lost my father, which was a lot 20 years ago, but I couldn't believe how people showed up and how much it meant to me. Because when you lose someone close to you, you feel like the world stops and there's this hole, and everybody should notice. And most of the world doesn't. They keep going on, right? And so when people stop and sit with that with you for a minute, even just to acknowledge it. And I actually think you're right that you mentioned that, some of your more lighthearted friends, but sometimes the people who are good at stepping up and showing up and saying something meaningful, or not trying too hard to say the right thing, but just kind of acknowledging how you feel, that's just a beautiful thing, I think. And those people make very good friends.
Definitely. Having had that experience, I think
Hmm.
has made it more um, important and clear about
Yeah.
exactly that in my own life, and almost looking for opportunities to do that
Right.
for
I think
others now
it
too.
does. Right.
I'm
It
feeling that
really,
way.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. It
Yeah.
makes you see, you go, oh, wait, I better make sure. And this is a big part of friendship,
Hmm.
is making sure that you treat people the way you want to be treated. Or when you notice that
Yeah.
something mattered to you, then you need to
Hmm.
try to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So shifting
Mm-hmm.
topics just slightly. When we first started talking, you were mentioning how we humans are really so fundamentally hardwired to
Mm-hmm.
be aware of others and of our social world and develop as social
Mm-hmm.
beings. And you mentioned babies and toddlers, and we
Mm-hmm.
know how critical those early childhood experiences are in
Mm-hmm.
terms of developing attachment styles. So, fundamental ways of relating to others, general expectations of who am I, who are other people, our ability to form healthy attachments.
Mm-hmm.
And we also know that there is another very critical phase of development that happens and it's not one, it happens throughout childhood, but as particularly children start to get older and focus more and more on their friendships and maybe pull away
Yeah.
from their families a little bit, like going into
Mm-hmm.
adolescence,
Mm-hmm.
that this is a really critical developmental stage. And I have also been thinking a lot and talking to clients who are worried about their children
Yeah.
who formerly had been, going to school and having relationships and running around and doing things,
Yeah.
and are now deprived of many of those experiences that are in some ways, I mean, they're always important to adults certainly, but
Mm-hmm.
as children are in the process of developing and not doing currently what nature really built them to do,
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts are about what it is that kids need in order to develop, and putting that into context of the
Mm-hmm.
now.
The now.
Yeah.
You're right. So one of the things that just in the last kind of
Hmm.
10 to 20 years that neuroscience has done is really discovered that there is this second critical period of development, really,
Yeah.
that is early adolescence from 9 to 13, or
Yeah.
and that there's an explosion of
Hmm.
connections again in the brain, and then a pruning back again.
Yeah.
And that means that children are in that moment are sort of ripe for learning, and a lot of the learning they're doing at that point is this social and emotional learning.
Hmm.
They're learning both, about themselves and their own identities, and then themselves in relation to others, and their friendships, their sort of emerging friendships, play a huge part in that. And it's not that kids don't have good friends before that, they do in elementary school, but there's something that shifts as they're coming into those pre-puberty and puberty years, middle school, where you really are generating this sense of yourself,
Hmm.
and what your interests are going to be, and how, where you can make a contribution in the world. And I mean that in the broadest sense, like
Hmm.
what's your what's your thing? Who
Yeah.
are you to everyone around you? And and often it often does have to do with your interests. Maybe it's I mean, I'll be curious to see whether we get I hope that the coronavirus brings a slew of kids with an interest in public health and medicine and
Yeah.
things like that. Or maybe it's social justice, or maybe it's theater, maybe it's sports, maybe, but you tend to start to figure out who you are in that, or maybe you love poetry, or, and you find the other kids who are like that. This is what the I mean, everybody's worried about the academic loss for kids who have been away from school, and that is a real thing. And that's an issue. But I've actually been doing quite a bit of reporting on this very question. So it's funny you should ask. Most teachers say, we can meet kids where they are. When they
Yeah.
come back, I mean, generally after the summer, there's learning loss, there's academic loss, kids have to make up. That's going to be worse if they get to go back to school physically in September, or if they're doing it remote. I think it will be a very different
Mm-hmm.
thing than it's been. This has been an emergency series of remote learning classes, right? It'll get
Yeah.
different. But what they aren't getting now is that social and emotional stuff that they really need with their peers.
Mm-hmm.
Very young kids really just need the safety of their parents, right? And then the oldest kids, the older adolescents and the young adult emerging adults, they're supposed to be launching and being independent and all of
Mm-hmm.
that stuff. That's how old my kids are, and
Mm-hmm.
they're stuck here with me. And fortunately we get along, but it's not how it was meant to be. And But the ones, I mean, so you can worry. So it's very age dependent, I guess is what I'm saying, that the effects and the consequences of this time away from peers and at home are different depending on how old you are. The young adolescents, I
Mm-hmm.
worry about. They are in a critical period for that development, but mostly I do think they will get that back. Maybe they're just kind of going to be on hold a little bit in there,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to push pause on that piece of development. And this it's they're not going to go for years without being with their peers.
Mm-hmm.
But there might be a few. So I mean, the big picture message is kids are resilient, and they're gonna, at all ages, most of them are going to be okay with this. But there is a concern that there will be some who miss that window of opportunity, right, to really sort of, I don't know, develop their that me you thing and that sense of
Yeah.
self, right? And then they're sort of just a little out of step after that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a concern, and it's a concern with the older kids who, as I said, are supposed to be in this transition. I mean, what adolescence is about, right, is developing your independence and moving away from the family. And so the fact that everybody has had to,
Mm-hmm.
move, just be only with your family, has
Yeah.
been rough. On the other hand, the social media and technology that we are
I
so
was,
worried about all the time, is that
yeah.
was going to be your next question?
Well, I was about to ask. Well,
Yeah.
finish your thought.
Well, just that, I had already written, I mean, and it's in my book, but I've also done
Mm-hmm.
other writing about this, but that there's been a raft of new research, fortunately, showing that our concerns about the effects of technology use on adolescent well-being, on
Mm-hmm.
everybody's well-being, but especially adolescents, are were overstated, overblown, really, that
Mm-hmm.
it's just not as bad on a population level. That doesn't mean there aren't some kids who are at risk, but they're already at risk usually.
Mm-hmm.
They're kids already suffering from depression and anxiety
Yeah.
where it's exacerbated. That's a slightly different problem than if social media is making everybody more depressed and more lonely and things like that. And that doesn't seem to be the case. There are effects, both positive and negative, but they're all very small, and
Mm.
far outweighed for kids by things like bullying and getting some sleep, getting sleep and eating
Yeah.
well, right? And so we just need to keep that in context. So that was already true. We knew that. And then the pandemic hit, and everybody had to go home and stay home and not see anybody. And the good news for kids is that they have this very fluid way of interacting with their friends, both
Mm-hmm.
online and off. And so on some levels, I think it came much more naturally to them than
Mm-hmm.
it did to adults. to have, to keep the virtual stuff going, the kids who are old enough for it,
Hmm.
right? And but it also, I thought it was interesting how upset they were at not seeing each other in person. I think was a reminder for adults to about how much they do spend time together in school, right? We don't see that, and then when they're home with us, we see them on their phones, and so we
Hmm.
we get upset because we think that's all they're doing, but actually
Yeah.
they've spent all day physically together, and they missed it terribly when this
Hmm.
happened, right? And that's, they're coming by that completely naturally. Their brains are designed for that. And so we've had to embrace technology fully, and parents have
Hmm.
had to rewrite the script and say, okay, here's a play date on Zoom. Right, here you go. And we've had to be okay with that. We'll see what happens when this all is over, but I mostly think it's been a very good thing, and that I can't imagine what this would have been like if we hadn't had all this technology.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful, and I think you just spoke to the question that I
Mm-hmm.
had been formulating, was around, how does socializing with peers in a virtual, non in person format affect that kind of brain development? Since you talk about the fundamentals of friendship as really being so biologically based, and I was wondering, is it as impactful? Say for I have an almost 12-year-old son who
Mm-hmm.
spends way too much time these days, but running through virtual worlds as an
Right, right,
avatar, little
right.
horde of boyfriends, and they are interacting and they're doing things and solving problems and getting into fights with each other and working it out. So like a lot of the work of friendship is definitely happening in this
It
in this
is
virtual space,
that, yeah.
but does that still have the same impact on that evolutionary biology, as your brain still getting what it needs in terms of that friendship experience if these interactions are not occurring
we
in
we do
person?
not
Mhm.
we do not really know,
Yeah.
because the nuances of this question that you're
Yeah.
asking, which I think at the heart what you're asking is, what is the worth of these different ways of interacting virtually? Like, is a
Yeah, in
video
our
chat more,
right, nourishing the
sustaining and
brain.
nourishing for the
Yes.
brain than
Hmm.
a text, and is this and that?
Yeah.
Nobody's really been able to study
Yeah.
that, because so much of the conversation has been about screen time,
Yeah.
and screen time is really a meaningless concept,
YouTube
actually.
is not the same thing as
It's not the
interacting.
same thing. I mean,
Yeah.
you could be FaceTiming your grandmother, and you could be
Mhm.
watching porn, and or and those are not the same, we hope. Right? But we don't really know. We haven't gotten, so much has been focused on the amount of time
Yeah.
and very little on the context and the
Yeah.
content. And that's
Right.
what we need to be doing. And I do think that this pandemic is jump starting some of
Mhm.
that science.
Yeah.
What we know is, or okay, so I'm guessing here based on partly what we know and partly what I can extrapolate from it.
Mhm.
One thing we do know is that active engagement seems to be better than passive, right? So, meaning I'm talking to you, I'm not just kind of watching you,
Yeah.
or I'm not scrolling through my feed alone, right? But even that, there's a lot we don't know about that, but we think that's
Mhm.
true. We do know that in person, face to face communication is really important. And I don't think that, a Zoom chat is going to replace it entirely,
Yeah.
but because there's something about the eye contact, and
Mhm.
actually in your brain, one of the reasons that things like Zoom sometimes are really unsatisfying is because if the timing is off, especially if there's more than two of you talking,
Yeah.
and there's a sort of temporal lag that happens there, is in science terms, but
Mhm.
which just means like that kind of frustrating, like, oh wait, what'd you say, like
Yeah.
or it takes a little too long to get the answer to the question. There's and it annoys our brains, and it doesn't feel quite normal, right?
Mhm.
And in person, if you're sitting on the couch with someone and you're just chatting, you don't get that in
Yeah.
the same way, right? And so there are things that technology cannot do, but there's a lot that it can do.
Mhm.
And so I think we are going to do, there will be a lot more nuanced, rigorous, sophisticated
Mhm.
work looking at those fine points after this
Mhm.
experience, especially. um, what I have seen, what I knew before was that if you use social media and technology as one extra channel with which to communicate with your friends, you will strengthen those bonds. But you
Mm.
do also have to see them in other ways, right? And I
Mhm.
still think that's going to end up being the
Yeah.
case, right?
Yeah.
That's probably a good place for everyone to,
Mm.
to land, is to
Mhm.
say, social media is not so terrible, but face to face is still really important. And I think
Yeah.
we're all going to fall back into each other's arms and
Oh my
hug, and
goodness.
when we can, wash our hands, and wear a mask. But we will
Yeah.
be, that is really important. That there's a reason why humans are so rarely alone in
Yeah.
evolutionary history. It's because we need each other.
Well, yes, yes, and just that drive to be together. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you wrote somewhere, and I think it was one of your articles, but that there's this craving for togetherness that is similar
Yes.
to hunger cravings,
Yes.
and I
Yes.
wanted to, if it's okay, bring this up and talk about this
Mm-hmm.
experience in a slightly different context too. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
prior to the apocalypse, right, and this social distancing, you know, for really years previously, and I know you've written about this. I mean, the big pandemic that was being
Mm-hmm.
discussed was a pandemic of loneliness that
Right.
was having adverse health outcomes. Mental health
Mm-hmm.
comes was associated with, substance use, just like all kinds of stuff
Mm-hmm.
that was happening prior to this.
Yes.
So I also heard you say, do we go back to how it was, or do we go forward into a new
Mm-hmm.
reality? And I know this is a huge, broad
Mm.
question, but like from your research and what you've learned, have you generated any takeaways around why people were struggling with loneliness before all of this? Like when you think about
Right.
loneliness, what was that about?
Loneliness is a subjective feeling of a
Hmm.
mismatch between the amount of social connection you have and the
Mm,
amount that you want,
I
right?
see.
And that's different from social isolation, which
Yeah.
is an objective measure of your social networks and the number of interactions that you
Hmm.
have. Social isolation is where we all are right now,
Hmm.
basically, in most states, in most
Yeah.
countries. Um, and and the interesting thing is that what what people have found, well, it's a little complicated, like a lot of
Hmm.
things, but that loneliness, that subjective feeling, um, is seems to be the thing that's really bad for us,
Mm.
because, and you can be lonely in a crowd, actually, right? That it captures that idea that
Yeah.
it really has to do with your own sense of connection and belonging, is what matters the most. And there's a kind of a sense of threat that you get. You may not recognize it as such, but that's actually what loneliness is,
Mm.
according to the science. And so there was this theory for quite a while that, that loneliness was like a physiological alarm bell, that
Hmm.
was just like hunger and thirst. Hunger tells you that it's time to eat,
Hmm.
and thirst that it's time to get some water, and
Survival drives.
survival drives. And loneliness is telling you to connect. It's
Mm.
saying your body is missing connection. On a short, um, for the in the short term, that's a healthy thing, right? That's And in the long term, though, it can pile up and it can
Hmm.
lead to these problems with your physical health.
Hmm.
And the thing I wanted to say is, so that theory has been around for a long time, and actually, amazingly, just at the beginning of this pandemic, and there was a preliminary report of research done at MIT, where for the first time, and this may be the thing that you saw that I wrote, but for the first time, they were able to see in the
Hmm.
deep in the midbrain that the feelings of loneliness do look like hunger in
Yeah.
that part of the brain, right? That the cravings are very similar. And so that this had been a theory for years, and a good one, and one that people thought made sense. But
Mm.
this was the first time that we had actual sort of neuroscientific evidence that
Yeah.
there's some truth to this. And so why were people lonely? Well, partly because it is a natural. So if you understand it that way, though, as, I mean, people have been hungry and thirsty
Yeah.
since people existed, right? I mean, in the wild, the entire the time that animals spend in the wild, I mean, their whole day is basically spent finding food and water, and in sustenance, in making a living. For a baboon means finding enough food to meet your energy needs, right? Humans in our modern society don't have to do it in quite the same way, but those same signals are still in our body. And so
Mhm.
that loneliness is a natural signal. And most people have experienced loneliness at some point in their
Yeah.
life. The problem is when it's chronic, right?
Mhm.
And now what we understand is that chronic loneliness has the effect of like chronic stress that we know is really bad for us, right? And it builds up over
Mhm.
time, and it gets your blood pressure and your heart rate and your immune system. I mentioned all these things earlier, and the way your brain works, and we don't know about all the mechanisms, all the ways in which that is happening exactly. We
Mhm.
know some pieces of it, uh, and but what we do see is that it is happening for sure. So one thing is that now we know loneliness is really bad for us in a
Mhm.
way that we didn't appreciate before. The other thing is that demographically, there are many more people living alone than there used to be. And some of them very happily living alone. Because I mentioned loneliness and social isolation, there's also
Yeah.
solitude,
Yeah.
right? And solitude is the word that we use to describe the pleasures of being
Mhm.
alone,
Mhm.
having peace and quiet, and getting to do it all our own way.
Yeah.
um, and so all those things can be true, right? And we but there are more people living alone. There are more people, that's more culturally acceptable, in certainly in the West. There are more people who choose not to marry,
Mm.
and there are and more older people choosing to live alone.
Mhm.
And so there are concerns about all of them, like
Mhm.
that just situationally, there's more risk. And there also just the numbers, our absolute numbers are greater, right? So our population keeps growing and our numbers of older people. And there's always been all this concern about older adults being so lonely. What I think is super interesting is that some
Mm.
of them are, and that is a real risk. But actually, adolescents report more loneliness than older adults, right? And
Mhm.
so I think we can't, it's sort of, sometimes people want to just think of it as this problem of, the retired people
Yeah.
who are, and actually a lot of those people are making their social circle smaller, but they're doing it on purpose because
Mhm.
they're being very intentional about
Yeah.
who they want to spend their time with. They're done putting up with the idiots or even the people who are
Yeah.
more work, more
Yeah.
drain, and they're like, these are the people I really care about, and this
Mhm.
is where I'm going to spend my time. And
Yeah.
there's a real beauty to that.
Mhm.
And so it's, the story is a little more nuanced
Yeah.
about loneliness than people often think.
Absolutely. Well, and it makes so much sense. And what we were talking, like that, the adolescent kind of hunger for that connection.
Mm-hmm.
But and I know we're coming up on our time, and this has been such a fascinating conversation, and just such a fascinating book that you've written. I mean, just
Thank
not,
you.
it's more than a book; it's a body of work. Um,
Wow.
and if but going back and putting all this together, so we've been talking about how fundamentally important high quality relationships are on so many different levels,
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, psychologically, for your health, for the health of well-being of others, and talking about how loneliness and social isolation are not the same things. I know that we're all socially isolated in some ways, and also I think more people have been thrust into an unwanted experience of
Mm-hmm.
loneliness lately,
Right.
just by virtue of the circumstances. Do
Mm-hmm.
you have any last words or advice for someone listening to this who may be feeling that hunger, that desire to connect with others, and for whom that, limited opportunities for connecting or building a network? What?
Yeah, it's so, I've talked to a lot of people
Mhm.
over the last few months about
Yeah.
this, and I've heard from a lot of lonely people, and I really feel for them. And I know that there are no simple answers,
No.
and so I want to acknowledge that,
Hmm.
there's a limit to what I can say
Of
and
course.
suggest. But I do think that in adulthood, which is where
Hmm.
a lot of people feel like it's so hard to make friends. And I'm going to relate this to the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic in a second, but just
Yeah.
for everybody all the time, making friends in adulthood can feel very hard. I think two things are true. One is that time is a really big piece of friendship. The amount of time it takes to make a good friend and to
Mm-hmm.
maintain a friendship, I think we underestimate what that is. And
Mm-hmm.
so we may give up on a new relationship or
Well,
potential
just to
friendship.
stop, what is a realistic?
So somebody counted. It takes 50 hours of time together to
Okay.
go from being an acquaintance to a casual friend. For most people to feel that somebody has become a friend,
Mm-hmm.
and then 90 hours to consider someone a good friend, and 200 hours to consider them a best friend,
Wow.
roughly.
Mm-hmm.
And um, that's those kinds of hours are easy to come by if you're in high school and college with people and you're in class together all day long, and then you're in the cafeteria or
Mm-hmm.
you're in a dorm room together, or that's what you do. And so you can rack that up in a matter of weeks, even certainly months. In adulthood, if you have a family and a job, and if you're like me, I work from home and I work on
Mm-hmm.
my computer all day long, right?
Yeah.
I It's just harder to put those hours together. In fact, in a study, um, they went all the way from adolescents to senior citizens, and they asked everybody every 2 hours, who were they with? Adolescents were with their friends 30% of the time, middle-aged adults 4% of the time, and older, over 65, 8% of the time. So as an adult, you're just not as likely to be
Mm-mm.
with friends. So one is that we underestimate the time it takes. And so we need to give ourselves more time with people and know that relationships take time.
Yeah.
And two, as an adult, I think it can be very hard to make yourself vulnerable and put
Mm-hmm.
yourself out there. But what you often do need to do in order to connect is to start by trying to find people with similar interests, or shared interest is a really tried and true,
Mm-hmm.
sounds very basic, but it does work.
Yeah.
You find people who are into gaming
Mm-hmm.
or craft beers or hiking or theater or whatever it is that you like and care about, but also volunteering.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so now in the pandemic, of course, we're really limited. We can't, there are very few of these things that we can do, and it's even harder to establish these new friendships and relationships. Like, I mean, if there's a hiking club in your area, maybe some of them are doing socially
Mm-hmm.
distanced hikes, and so that's a possibility, but it's not a moment. But volunteering is a really good way of getting to know people, because you come together over something else. You're
Mm-hmm.
not being thrown together with the idea that now you're going to try to make friends.
Yeah.
And it seems to work. It seems to help a lot of people. And if it doesn't, at least you've done something useful along the way. So I do think in this moment, there's plenty of that to do, like banding together with the people near you to sort of help your community as we are all dealing with this problem is a useful thing to think about. And the last thing I'll say is, later, when this becomes true, I understand now that there are apps out there for making friends, not just like there are
Oh,
dating apps.
yeah.
There are apps for making friends. And so
Yeah.
I think that's kind of intriguing. I have never tried it. I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
can't, but I have heard from people who have that sometimes it works, because that's where you really know that you're meeting someone who is also looking to make a friend,
Yes. Who
right?
who is
And you can
able
kind of
and
match each
willing
other
to.
up, and who's able
Mm-hmm.
and willing. So I think that's in, curious and encouraging, maybe that's out there. People can find that
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even they can do that now, and then
Mm-hmm.
just have Zoom calls with people,
Mm-hmm.
or phone calls, or meet up, in the park 10 feet apart, or whatever it is. um,
Mm-hmm.
those are some thoughts.
Those are wonderful thoughts. And I have so enjoyed our Zoom
Yes,
call today,
me
Lydia. This has
too,
been a
me too.
fascinating conversation. So, again, Lydia Denworth, the book is called Friendship. And, Lydia, if people were going to buy the book or have
Yes.
more opportunities to spend time with you and take advantage of all of the wonderful information and resources that you've put together, where would they find you, the book, upcoming events?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much everything you can find at my website, which is lydiadenworth.com. And I'm at Lydia Denworth on social media, on Twitter and Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
And I have a newsletter on my website people can sign up for if they're really interested in keeping up with, where I sort of put out everything that I'm doing, and also kind of what I'm reading and listening to, things
I'm
like your
signing up.
podcast. Yeah. And so, yeah, people can find me there. And the book, here we go. We'll do a
Hmm.
little show and tell. Here's the book with the friendship bracelets with DNA. Very
I love
clever.
it.
The book is basically available wherever books are sold, which right now in the pandemic is not so many places. But I highly recommend, by the way, not just for me, but that people who are interested in books and supporting independent bookstores go to bookshop.org, which is a new site that is pulling books from independent bookstores and benefiting bookstores. And so you can buy books. You just have to do it online or from a distance. And your local bookstores are often selling books and just doing curbside delivery and things. So please support authors and
Bookstore,
books.
bot, bookshop.
Bookshop.org.
I'll be.
Bookshop.org. And that's not just for me, that's for
Hmm.
all
Yeah.
the authors of the world. It's very, very important that we support bookstores and authors in this time.
Yeah.
And so I hope that people will go check it out.
Well, I'll be sure to link to that site as
Okay,
well as yours, and
great.
include
Thank
links
you.
to where our listeners can find you. Thank you again so much for your time. I
Thank you
really
so much.
appreciate our
It's been great
conversation.
talking to you.
Thank you.